5 words. That's what most people remember about this order, if they remember anything at all. Not one step back. Stamped on postage, quoted in documentaries, treated like the whole document was a slogan. It wasn't. Stalin never called it that. His soldiers did. And the 5 words everyone remembers turn out to be the least important part of what he actually wrote down on the 28th of July 1942. The part that mattered, the part that changed how an army thinks about retreat, about cowardice, about who gets to live and who gets sent forward into a minefield as punishment. That part isn't 5 words. I'll come back to that. Keep it in mind, because by the end of this, you'll understand exactly what the real order said, and why historians are still arguing more than 80 years later about whether it saved the Soviet Union or simply added a Soviet death toll to a German one. I'm Arthur Finch. To understand why this document exists, you have to sit where Stalin was sitting in the summer of 1942. Not in hindsight. In the actual moment, with the actual information he had. Moscow had held the previous winter, that much was true. But the front in the south had collapsed again, and collapsed badly. German Army Group South had broken through toward the Caucasus, toward the oil fields at Maikop and Grozny, the fuel the entire Soviet war machine ran on. Rostov-on-Don, a city of 500,000 people, fell in days. Soviet divisions that were supposed to hold defensive lines along the Don River instead found those lines already abandoned by the units meant to be there, retreating without orders, sometimes without much resistance at all. Sevastopol had fallen in the Crimea after an 8-month siege. Leningrad was still strangled, still starving, still under siege with no end visible. This was the second summer of catastrophe. And the first one, 1941, when German forces reached the outskirts of Moscow and took millions of Soviet soldiers prisoner in a string of encirclements so large they're still hard to comprehend. That first catastrophe was supposed to have been the worst of it, the one the Red Army learned from. Instead, here it was again, another July, another collapse. There's a particular kind of fear that sets in the second time a disaster repeats itself, and it's different from the fear of the first time. The first time, soldiers can tell themselves it was a surprise, a failure of intelligence, a German army that simply outmatched expectations. By the summer of 1942, that excuse was gone. Units along the Don front were retreating not because they'd been outflanked in some clever encirclement, but because the order to hold had simply dissolved into confusion. And men who'd survived the previous year's catastrophe were making an individual, rational calculation that survival meant moving east, away from the guns, with or without permission. That's not cowardice in any simple sense. It's what happens to an army that has already watched its own command structure fail it once, and has no particular reason to trust it won't fail again. Soviet commanders on the ground were reporting something Stalin's general staff found almost as alarming as the German advance itself. That entire formations were arriving at new defensive lines under strength, disorganized, having shed equipment and cohesion along the retreat, sometimes having abandoned positions before a single German shell had landed near them. This is the specific failure Order 227 was written to address. Not a single battle lost. A pattern repeating itself of armies that dissolved under pressure before they were actually defeated. Stalin had the casualty figures in front of him. Soviet military intelligence had already calculated by mid-1942 that the country had lost access to roughly 70 million people and a large share of its grain and metal production to German occupation. Not soldiers, that's territory and population, gone behind enemy lines. The man writing this order was not posturing for history. He was looking at numbers that told him the Soviet Union no longer had the population advantage over Germany that it had started the war with. That sentence alone should tell you how serious the room was when this thing was drafted. So on the 28th of July, Stalin issued what was officially titled Order Number 227, on measures to strengthen discipline and order in the army and prohibiting unauthorized withdrawal from combat positions. Not catchy, not meant to be. It was read aloud to troops at the front by political officers, not printed and handed out, read aloud, which tells you something about how Stalin wanted it delivered. As a verdict, spoken to your face, not a leaflet you could fold up and forget. Picture what that actually looked like. A political officer standing in front of a company or a battalion that had just spent days retreating. Men still carrying the exhaustion and the shame of ground they'd given up, and being told to stand and listen while someone read them in full a document that named their own failures in numbers. Population lost, grain lost, steel lost, before it ever got to the punishment. No printed copies circulated among the rank and file for men to read at their own pace, to absorb privately, to argue about quietly among friends. It arrived as something heard all at once, in formation, with everyone around you hearing the exact same words at the exact same moment. That detail matters more than it might seem. A document you read alone you can dismiss or doubt or forget by the next day. A document read aloud to your entire unit becomes something closer to a shared fact. Everyone in that formation now knows that everyone else heard the same warning, the same threat, the same admission of how close to losing the war their own government believed they were. And here's where the document does something almost nobody expects from Stalin. It doesn't open with blame pointed outward at the enemy. It opens with blame pointed inward at the Red Army itself, in language brutally honest about failure. The order states plainly that the army has lost ground it should not have lost, that panic and what it calls alarmist thinking have spread among troops who a year earlier fought with far more resolve. It is, by Soviet standards of public messaging in 1942, an extraordinary admission. Stalin's regime did not usually tell its own soldiers the truth about how badly things were going. This time it did. The order spells out the numbers, the population lost, the grain lost, the steel lost, in the kind of detail that wartime propaganda almost never permits. Because that kind of honesty can break morale as easily as it can shock people into action. Whoever advised Stalin on tone here was gambling that fear of the truth would do more for discipline than the usual comforting lies. Wait, sit with that for a second, because it matters more than it sounds like right now. A government that built its entire wartime narrative on confidence and inevitable victory had just told its own army, point blank, that it might be losing. Then comes the part people actually remember. Every commander, every soldier, ordered to defend ground without retreat, to the last drop of blood. Anyone who retreats without an order from a superior labeled a traitor to the country. And then the mechanism. Penal battalions, made up of officers found guilty of cowardice or instability, sent to the most dangerous sectors of the front to, in the order's own words, atone for their crimes against the motherland with blood. And behind the front lines, blocking detachments, armed units positioned to stop, by force if necessary, soldiers retreating without authorization. This is the image that survived in popular memory. The blocking detachment with a machine gun, supposedly mowing down its own retreating comrades. It's a vivid picture, and it's not entirely fiction. These units existed, they were real, and they did shoot deserters. But the popular image has outrun the documented reality in one important way. The wholesale machine gunning of entire retreating units, the image from countless films, is not well supported by the archival record. What the record does support is something almost as grim in a quieter way. Roughly 400,000 men eventually passed through penal battalions over the course of the war, and close to half of them were killed or wounded carrying out the deliberately suicidal assignments, frontal assaults on fortified positions, walks across minefields to clear them with their own bodies, that the order had created a legal mechanism to assign them to. 400,000 men. Half of them did not come back the way they went in. This is the part of the story that doesn't make it onto the postage stamp. And it wasn't only the rank and file who paid that price. The order placed a particular weight on commanders, the men whose decision to retreat could now be treated on its own as evidence of treason. Soviet military tribunals in the months after July 1942 recorded a sharp rise in field executions of officers, division and regimental commanders among them, for the specific offense of withdrawing without authorization. The documentation here is uneven. Soviet wartime tribunal records were not always preserved with the same rigor as the order itself, and historians have had to reconstruct the scale of these executions from post-war testimony, NKVD reports, and the diaries of men who watched it happen, rather than from one clean, complete ledger. But what survives is consistent enough to draw a clear picture. Officers who a year earlier might have been reprimanded or reassigned for a tactical retreat were now, in case after documented case, removed from command and shot, sometimes in front of the very men they had led. The order had converted a battlefield judgment call, when to hold and when to fall back, into something with no safe answer at all. Hold an unholdable position and lose your men to German guns. Retreat to save them and risk losing your own life to a tribunal that, after July 28th, had explicit written authority to call that retreat treason. Now here's where the historiography actually gets interesting, because the debate isn't simply, was this cruel? Of course it was cruel. The debate is whether it worked, and on whom. Some historians point to the autumn of 1942 and note something the order's defenders rarely mention. The order was not, in fact, uniformly followed. Soviet army inspectors, in their own internal reports from September of that year, only 6 weeks after the order was issued, wrote that discipline remained low and that Order 227 was, in their words, not being carried out by all soldiers and officers. The retreat in the south continued for weeks, after the order was read aloud at every front. German troops pushed another 800 kilometers toward the Caucasus oil fields after July 28th. The defense of those oil fields that autumn cost the Red Army roughly 200,000 more lives. If the order was meant to be an immediate switch that stopped the bleeding, the numbers say otherwise. The bleeding continued, badly, for months. So if the order didn't stop the retreat by force alone, what actually changed? This is where the testimony of the soldiers who lived through it becomes more useful than the document itself. Veterans interviewed decades later, men who'd served at Stalingrad and beyond, describe something that sounds almost contradictory at first. Relief. Not relief at the threat of execution, relief at being told the truth, and at having a clear, unambiguous line drawn under what would and would not be tolerated. One veteran, recalling the order years afterward, put it simply, that hearing it made the men feel they finally knew exactly where they stood, and that knowing, even under threat, felt better than the confusion and shame of the previous year's collapse. A soldier named Moskvin recorded in his diary, weeks after the order was read to his unit, simply that they had heard Order 227, a flat, almost unremarkable diary entry, the kind people write about something that has already become an accepted fact of daily life rather than a shock. That's the harder truth historians have had to sit with. The order's coercive machinery, the penal battalions, the blocking detachments, left a paper trail soaked in blood. 400,000 men funneled into deliberately suicidal duty. But the order's psychological function, the blunt admission of crisis, combined with an unambiguous moral line, appears to have done something the machine guns alone could not. It gave an exhausted, frightened army a fixed point to stand on, at the exact moment Stalingrad was about to become the place where the entire German summer offensive would be broken. Stalingrad itself began only weeks after this order was issued. The city with the retreat finally actually stopped, not because of blocking detachments shooting their own men in large numbers, which the evidence doesn't support, but because, district by district, building by building, Soviet soldiers chose to hold ground they'd been told, in the starkest language their government had ever used with them, that they were not permitted to abandon. This is the part that matters. Order 227 did not win Stalingrad. Logistics won Stalingrad. Zhukov's encirclement plan won Stalingrad. The German failure to seize the city before winter won Stalingrad. But the order may have bought the time those larger forces needed to take effect by making retreat for a critical stretch of weeks
a worse option in a soldier's mind than holding a position that looked, by any rational calculation, unholdable. So go back to the 5 words, not one step back.
Here's the detail that the slogan erases completely. Those 5 words don't appear as a standalone phrase anywhere as the order's official title. The document was never named that by Stalin or by the Soviet High Command. It was named that afterward by the men who'd had it read to them, who needed something short enough to say out loud, something that captured what they'd just been told, without repeating the whole brutal text of population figures and execution clauses and penal battalion procedures. The soldiers gave the order its nickname, not the dictator who wrote it. That's the reversal sitting underneath this entire story. The phrase history remembers is folk shorthand from the men who had to live inside the order, not propaganda handed down from above. And the actual content of the order, the part that did the damage and by some accounts also did the work, was never those 5 words at all. It was the unflinching admission that the Soviet Union might be losing, paired with a mechanism that made 400,000 men pay in blood for the chance to prove it wasn't. Historians will keep arguing about the balance of that ledger, how much was saved against how much was spent. I'm not going to pretend that argument is settled, because it isn't, and anyone who tells you it is hasn't read the casualty figures from the penal battalions closely enough. What I can tell you is this: an order remembered for 5 words of defiance was, underneath, an order built on an admission of near defeat. And somewhere in that contradiction, between the truth Stalin was finally willing to tell his own army and the price he was willing to make that army pay to act on it, is the real reason this single piece of paper still gets argued about 80 years on, by people who've spent careers trying to weigh what it actually cost against what it actually saved. If you want to keep digging into moments like this one, the documents, the decisions, the people who lived inside them, I keep a running thread of sources and notes over on the channel's Telegram, linked below. I'm Arthur Finch. Thank you for spending this time with me.